morning. Welcome. Thank you everyone for being here. I am just checking all the settings and stuff, just trying to make sure that people can let themselves in. Good morning. Yeah, thank you all for being here. I can't believe it's morning even. It feels like the afternoon already. And I think as well, because it feels like the last few of these webinars have been in the afternoon. So I'm very proud of myself already for not falling on my face there and saying good afternoon. So there's my way of the day. There's my little win already. I hope everyone's doing really well, or as well as we can be after what might have been a busy week. You know, maybe you don't work the traditional Monday to Friday 9 to 5 and your week's starting right now. Maybe you're not even in work today. Regardless, I hope your week is going as well as it possibly can. We're going to start quite promptly today because I'm really mindful that this is such an enormous topic that we could cover, and it is very much an introductory session to it. So yeah, I'm just really conscious of the time and I don't want to waste your time chewing your ears off too much. So today's session is very, very much, as the title suggests, an introduction to this umbrella term of neurodivergence for managers. So, you know, the idea with this session was that it was, very, very much geared for people who are in a leadership position, whether it's you're a senior manager, a middle manager, maybe you're a team leader, maybe you're a supervisor, for example, maybe you mentor volunteers. It doesn't matter. But essentially, this is really an introductory session to thinking about the people that you might support, essentially. So just to give you a very, very quick idea of what we're going to be covering, and then also who we are and what we do and how the session goes. So we're introducing this term neurodivergence, which again, we're all going to come here today with a different level of understanding to begin with. And we're going to be thinking about really what this term means. What is neurodivergence? Thinking a little bit and reflecting a little bit on the challenges that can present for neurodivergent employees. And we're going to introduce you to thinking a little bit about how we can support neurodivergent employees. We like, for anyone who's not been on our sessions before, we like to make these sessions as interactive as possible. Essentially at PMAC, we specialise in very bespoke trainings for businesses. So, you know, if we're thinking about neurodivergence, we can be as broad or as specific as is necessary. We tailor sessions, again, maybe to managers, or sessions that are for everyone to try and improve understanding. We tailor it whether it's in person versus online, doing workshops, consulting on things like your recruitment processes. So just by the nature of the fact that we like to make it as useful as we possibly can, we also like the opportunity, even on these free webinars where, you know, it is more generalized, to just learn from one another's experiences. Because even though we're not all joining today from the same organizations, even the same industries, through our own experiences, lived experience, personal experience managing people, we'll all have some brilliant ideas and reflections that we can share. So there are opportunities today to share through the chat, in which case you're more than welcome to share through the chat. For those of you who have the function available, and I can't control whether or not your organisation allows you to access this, but we've also got things like word clouds and polls where you can engage anonymously, so people can't see who's sharing what there. So if you feel more comfortable using that format, you're more than welcome to. If you'd rather use the chat, you're also more than welcome to, but just be mindful that other people can, you know, potentially see your name there. So with that, we'll kind of get started. Also, actually, it might be useful to just kind of preface this just by introducing the fact that I myself, as Hayley, one of the trainers at PMAC, I'm also neurodivergent, and I have lots of experience working with neurodivergent individuals, working as a psychological practitioner in my role here at PMAC. So first of all, again, just to kind of help me to understand your understanding so far, because again, we're all going to come here today with a different baseline level of understanding of what this topic is, and that's okay. We're all at where we're at, essentially. But when I'm using this term neurodivergence and neurodivergent, what is your understanding of just what that term means, what that relates to? And again, a box should have popped up on your screen. In which case, if it has, and you're able to share a response in that, any responses in there will be anonymous. You can also find this function by going through the chat. You're also welcome to use the chat function, whatever's available to you today, and whatever you feel most comfortable with. So we've got some brilliant responses, and actually on that note, so one of the responses already is autism. We're not, because it's such an introductory level today, we're not going into specific like neurodivergent conditions today. We do on other sessions, but also sometimes what we find, it can be more useful because neurodivergent people often have more than one form of neurodivergence. Just thinking specifically about diagnoses, it isn't always the most helpful thing as a manager anyway. So I love the honesty here. We've got people saying, I'm not too sure. And that is absolutely okay. And I'm just genuinely very grateful that you're here and open-minded and willing to learn. So thank you for being here for anyone who isn't sure what this is. Differences in brain chemistry, brains being wired differently, thinking differently, experiencing the world differently, different ways of brain functioning and thinking. And processing information. We've got when brains translate information differently to the norm. Absolutely. And I love that use of the word translate, because sometimes, you know, for people, particularly even when we think about like communication differences, rather than feeling like it's a language difference, many people that I've worked with have reported it feels more like I'm speaking a different language, actually, and one that feels like it's constantly changing and impossible to learn at times. Processing information. We've got some people saying like mostly autism and ADHD. ADHD is coming up a few times. Thinking outside the box. Brain not processing things in a typical way. A learning need, an umbrella term for differences in the way that our brains process things. Just variety. Brains that see things slightly differently, thinking outside the box, having a different view of the world, approaching the day-to-day differently. People might need additional support or adjustments to fulfill the role, operating away different from the norm. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. I've also just saw the word strength in there. And that's really important as well, because when we're using the term different, first of all, which we're about to, different isn't an inherently bad thing. And at the same time, this neurodivergence, it is quite complex. There are people who are neurodivergent tend to have what we call like a spiky skill set or a spiky profile. There tend to be things that other people, neurotypical people, take for granted, never have to think about, like just being in a environment. A neurodivergent person might experience that same environment very differently. That means just being there is much more difficult, like just reading. That again, many neurotypical people just find absolutely easy breezy, never have to think about it. It's not exhausting, hard work. It doesn't cause stress, anxiety. And if you're neurodivergent, your experience of that might be very different. And so there are some areas where maybe our skills aren't as kind of what would be considered typical, and maybe there are some challenges there, and with support, again, we can still achieve things. And there are other areas where people might excel and have, you know, heightened abilities to do things. So this spiky skill set and understanding that is really important. And what that means is that in some areas of neurodivergent people's lives, they will excel in things and be brilliant at things. And that does not mean that it is only a superpower and that people don't experience very real challenges. Neurodivergent conditions are also recognised disabilities, essentially. So both of those things can be true at the same time. Every neurodivergent person's experience of being neurodivergent, the way that they talk about their neurodivergence, think about their neurodivergence, is going to be very uniquely different. Because again, we're also all just individuals living very different lives in different environments, and that's okay, essentially. So as many people said, neurodivergence refers to people whose brains process information, learn, experience the world differently from what's considered typical. So it's really a different, what's called neurotype, a different brain type. It's the result of natural variation in our brains. And again, different isn't inherently a bad word, essentially. Many neurodivergent conditions are also referred to as neurodevelopmental conditions because there is no before. Someone who is autistic, who is diagnosed in their 60s, has always been autistic. This isn't something that has just now come on in the last few years. Someone who is dyslexic, who's diagnosed in their 40s, has always been dyslexic, essentially. And how this presents can look different across the course of our lives. And even things like stress, being exhausted, feeling unwell can amplify some of these differences, in the same way that for anybody, being stressed, unwell, hormones, pregnancy can impact just how we function day to day. But they are not a sign that somebody is mentally ill, although, again, many of the challenges that neurodivergent people face can increase the risk of us struggling with our mental health. And it's also not a reflection of intelligence or abilities. And there are many, many, many forms of neurodivergence, as some people mentioned in the chat, things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, as I've mentioned, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, OCD can be a form of neurodivergence. So just to remember again that neurodivergence will impact everybody differently, and many people will have more than one form of neurodivergence, essentially. So as managers, rather than necessarily focusing on diagnoses, which people might not have and might not feel comfortable to share, and understandably so, we can just kind of try our best to understand how any individuals experiencing their work and the workplace, and what challenges they are experiencing uniquely, and how we can support them to manage those challenges and to reduce those challenges. So like I said, neurodivergence often co-occurs with other forms of neurodivergence, and we also see lots of comorbidity with other challenges like co-occurring health issues, gastrointestinal disorders, for example, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, as just a few examples. And again, we're also more likely to have co-occurring mental health challenges alongside this. And when people are given the right support, they can excel. And there are legal obligations here that we're going to touch on later, and moral obligations. And just like we said, both things can be true at the same time, that people can have strong abilities in one area, and their neurodivergence can also be disabling, essentially. So again, we're not having to aim for one overarching view here, just take each individual and their perspective as it comes. Now, I know we've had just a very, 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 very brief overview kind of into what this term neurodivergence is, what it refers to, but just based again on your understanding so far, your experiences so far, whether it's direct lived experience as someone who is neurodivergent, whether it's indirect experience, you've been around people who are neurodivergent, whatever this looks like, do we think that it's true or false that neurodivergent employees are typically, as like kind of the standard, the average, treated fairly in the workplace? And again, we will all interpret this word fair differently, but if in this instance we're thinking about just being treated with respect and being accepted, and not having to experience things like harassment or discrimination related to their neurodivergence, or related to other protected characteristics, other disabilities, for example, or their gender diversity, for example, do we think that just as a standard, as a whole, neurodivergent people, regardless of where you are likely to be accepted in the workplace? So again, whether that's come up for you as a poll, and you can vote for that. And again, there's some slight nuance there, so you could have voted true or false, not sure, or depends. At the minute, about 50% of people who voted have said it depends. Second most popular answer is false. So there's about 30% of people there saying false. And in the chat, again, we've also got a couple of responses there saying false. So absolutely, unfortunately, the response to this is false. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of studies now. Unfortunately, the research in this area is growing. So we're going to have better and better understanding as time passes, hopefully. But so CIPD found that out of 790 employees who identified as neurodivergent, only 52% of them felt that their organisation had an open and supportive climate. 1 in 5 experienced harassment and discrimination. And again, different studies will report things differently, but generally, bullying, exclusion, harassment is something that unfortunately can be quite common for neurodivergent people to experience in the workplace. Another study from the Birkbeck Institute at the University of London, who did a survey of like 990 neurodivergent employees, about 65% were worried about requesting support due to fear of stigma and discrimination from managers. So it's not even just about thinking about colleagues particularly, but, you know, in just that survey, most neurodivergent people were worried about requesting accommodations that they needed and deserved and, you know, were more than entitled to, for fear of the response from the managers, essentially. So that in and of itself is just something to bear in mind, given that, you know, sometimes as a manager, maybe we forget that we are in a very trusted position, in a position of influence, and there is an inherent power imbalance. And like I said, it's just something to kind of bear in mind, essentially, moving forward. Because unfortunately, typically within the workplace, what then can happen is neurodivergent people are expected to, or feel that they are expected to, just behave as though they're neurotypical, and to just bend and shape and fit themselves to just be what is expected of everybody else, essentially, and just be, you know, behave as though our brains aren't fundamentally different. And not only is that, you know, extremely damaging to sense of self, self-esteem, and all that sort of stuff, and at the same time also it's very, very, very damaging for the workplace, for the environment. It's just, yeah, it's just not very pleasant whatsoever. So we're going to be thinking today again about the unique challenges that people might experience, and also thinking a little bit about how we can support people and be a bit more neuroaffirming. That's something that we're always talking about. Because again, when we talk about support and signposting, again, the goal here is not for people to become neurotypical, but to support them to perform to the best of their ability, so that they can get that sense of achievement and belonging and all the brilliant job satisfaction that everybody else, you know, also receives. So, like we said, we're not talking about specific diagnoses here today, but just as some examples, like I've already kind of touched on, neurodivergence can impact reading ability, for example. So things like just how somebody processes written information. And again, one thing to start to consider here is whether sometimes the challenge relates to the neurodivergence itself, or the environments that people are in and how we are presenting information. So, for example, sometimes, so like with dyslexia, for example, people may struggle with the, you know, not only reading, but it can be more challenging, for example, if that written information is always presented as black text on white background, full of jargon, lots of lengthy, you know, documents with 70 odd pages in, like an employee handbook, for example. That in and of itself, just the way that it's presented, as well the fact that it's presented in written information, when somebody may benefit and, you know, from understanding better, storing information better, making sense of it better if it was presented in another format, like having a conversation, like through infographics, like through flowcharts, like through videos, for example. So there can be differences in processing written information, making sense of what you're reading, remembering that, being able to use that information. Also, things like ADHD can impact your ability to read and read accurately, and pay attention to what you're reading and to store that information. Dysgraphia can impact our reading ability. So again, rather than just thinking about, you know, diagnoses, reading differences can present with a number of neurodevelopmental conditions. Also, other people might read very, very accurately and remember what they've read, retain things extremely well, and remember details that other people didn't even notice when they were reading it. Coordination can present differently. And again, we might see this with things like dyspraxia. We can also see this presented with like autism, with ADHD, for example, again with dysgraphia. So this might mean that how people just physically navigate the environment looks different and is a challenge. So whether that means that people, you know, even small things like navigating PPE, you know, handling very fiddly work, having to be very precise with weighing very small, I don't know, bits and bobs, screws, as an example. I don't know why that example came to mind from a very specific organisation, but then also, you know, just safely navigating an environment. This might also present as things like what appears as clumsiness and carelessness, and it's absolutely not. It's just a difference in the way that a brain is working that does impact coordination, spatial awareness, and again, just even being aware of the fact that other people perceive these differences, often through quite a negative light, impacts things like how comfortable we feel in an environment, baseline levels of stress. And interestingly as well, when we think about neurodivergence, again, stress makes all of these challenges even greater typically. There might be difference in how anyone at any given time is experiencing just the physicality of the environment because of these sensory inputs. So maybe people will be experiencing heightened sensitivity to things like the fluorescent lights that other people are finding absolutely fine. Somebody else might experience migraines. They might notice flickering that other people aren't. People might find that the level and complexity of different sounds coming from all different directions, from whether it's the kettle in the kitchen that they can absolutely hear boiling and the clanging of someone's spoon hitting against the cup every time they stir, and they're having conversations and the drawers are being opened and closed, whilst also being in an open plan office and you can hear the tapping of everybody and a phone call over there and the curtains being kind of pulled and the sound of the metal against the pole. All of that, you know, like we said, whether it's overstimulation, the hypersensitivity to just the environment that you're in, or hyposensitivity and needing more stimulation essentially to feel okay, all of that can be a very, very real challenge for neurodivergent people, like we said, in inverted commas, just existing in a workplace that other people aren't having to think about. And when people try to advocate for themselves, ask for a break from the environment, ask to turn something down, ask to adjust the lighting, for example, people can be in environments, you know, where people aren't so neuroaffirming or aren't so understanding. Sometimes neurodivergent people are made to feel as though they're being dramatic, and they're not. They are actually just experiencing all of these things to a greater extent than other people, or a lesser extent than other people, all of which makes just, again, being there a very different and challenging experience. Organisation can present very differently. So things like just staying on task, starting a task, particularly if it's a task that's maybe really important and it isn't urgent or you're not as interested in it. Having a brain that doesn't take action when you want it to and you need it to because you know that this is important and everyone else is doing it and you're going to get in trouble if you don't do it. Having a brain that doesn't just do those things because you want it to is incredibly difficult and overwhelming and challenging. And again, often they're met with lots of feedback from other people about how it should just be so easy. And people are very, very aware of that. Things like our memory can be impacted, working memory, holding on to a bit of information, like somebody coming over to you when you're in the middle of a task and you're focused on that task, somebody coming over, disrupting you, asking you to do something, and being able to hold that information in mind and come back to it later. And so actually, when we think about organisation and things like how able we are to maintain our focus, whether that's a challenge holding your focus, whether we hold our focus so well that it becomes very difficult to switch to another task, all of these things, like we said, these differences, as challenging as it may be sometimes for managers to make sense of, first of all, it might not be the individual that's the problem. It might be that we as managers are going asking somebody to do something when they're in the middle of a task. Maybe we're expecting them to switch too often, for example. And again, just bearing in mind that it's significantly more challenging for that person. So again, it can be, you know, present in two different areas, in two different ways here, whether it's a real challenge with this and being super, super, super organised, hyper-focused to the extent that, you know, it might work so well and so focused for so long that we forget to eat and drink and go to the toilet, all of which then might make us feel unwell. And then even just things like communication. So again, these are just some of the differences it can present. And again, they might present in more than one form of neurodivergence as well. So again, I know we're not talking about specific conditions here, but just understanding that actually we are not all experiencing the same conversations, the same social environments in the same way. And whether that be that some people are more literal in their communication. And so if you say you ask someone to help you for 5 minutes, they might take that as you need help for 5 minutes. And if after 5 minutes the task isn't quite done, if they've taken that literally, they might then leave. You feel confused as to why somebody's left. I was asking you to just help with this task and estimating it's going to take 5 minutes. If you ask somebody to look over look over something, they might literally look at it. You might not get an email with all sorts of feedback and edits made because you've not literally asked for that for example. So again, where we notice differences in, you know, what we think we're asking people to do, what we've hinted, what we've implied, for example, versus how people actually behave and how they perform, again, sometimes actually the fault is not in the other person's understanding, but in our communication as managers. There might be differences in the non-verbal communication, for example, like, you know, whether that's even like in a big meeting, picking up on social cues in terms of when it's time to speak, reading other people's body language and believing that you're interpreting their facial expressions, their tone of voice accurately and understanding what that means. Also, maybe this looks like for some people feeling like you're constantly having to monitor your facial expressions as a neurodivergent person, because just how you look when you're concentrating or you're thinking or you're just quite content somewhere, other people might perceive that we're not facially or through our body language looking the way that they expect us to if we're happy to be there, or and just to saying, yeah, no, I'm fine, I'm good, I'm not angry, I'm just focusing, I'm just listening really intensely. Other people might not accept that or believe that. There might be differences in eye contact. And again, you know, eye contact for some people might be extremely uncomfortable, overwhelming, distracting. It's then very difficult to focus on the conversation. And yet, again, this neurotypical society that we're in, people might be expected constantly to do something that is overwhelming, challenging, physically painful, maybe even to do, to hold eye contact, to show that you are paying attention, that you're listening, for example. So again, hopefully we're starting to see here that, you know, the difference in and of itself does present challenges, and many of the challenges that neurodivergent people come across within the workplace aren't actually the result of their differences, but the expectations of everybody else around them, or the environment in and of itself not being adaptable to accommodate the fact that, you know, through no fault of their own, they are just experiencing the same tasks differently, the same conversations differently. So with that in mind, again, we've only very briefly touched on some differences in how they can present, but, and again, bearing in mind that you're all going to be in very, very different workplaces here, different environments. Some of you might be working from home exclusively. Some of you might be in very, very busy, dynamic retail environments or hospitality environments, working different hours, all of that. But just taking a moment to reflect on the fact that, again, in any given moment, other people might actually be experiencing the same tasks, environment, conversations very, very, very differently, in a way that means that being there, doing that might be very challenging for them. Just what kind of things actually on reflection might be quite challenging for people who are neurodivergent in your workplaces, in your line of work. So we've got some things in here about sensory overload. And again, this is something that just because you personally as someone who's neurotypical, or maybe you're neurodivergent and you don't have hypersensitivity to sound, as an example, just because you're not experiencing the background noise, the lighting, the smell, the heat in the room as distressing, uncomfortable, overwhelming, distracting, doesn't mean that somebody else is exaggerating, is putting things on. Like, they are just genuinely experiencing that differently, and nobody should be you know, expected to be in discomfort, in physical pain at work. Like, the openness, we've got things like isolation, knowing how to prioritize. Yeah, and if you're in an environment that, you know, is again very dynamic, fast paced, everything feels urgent all of the time, other people are constantly giving you something to do, maybe last minute, knowing how to prioritize and prioritizing effectively in a way that doesn't absolutely overwhelm you and mean that your needs are always last, absolutely might be a challenge. Lots of stuff here around like the environments, the noise, loud environments, the fact that things being too open plan, too much noise, stresses from pressures, external pressures, the internal pressures we might put on ourselves as well, dealing with changes, lack of focus if you're not interested in stuff, going through like process driven work, perceptions of what other people say, absolutely. And this is such a challenge for neurodivergent people, because when we've spent a lifetime of having, you know, corrective feedback about who you are, how you're being, there's often this sense of, you know, it's often kind of a typical thing that, oh, just be yourself and people like you. But it often feels like if you're neurodivergent, that comes with the caveat, be yourself, but not quite like that. If you just tone this bit of yourself down. If you just behave in this way that's unnatural for you, just to make other people feel better, so you're accepted better. Often as well, people will get this sense that maybe people think I'm, again, too loud, too distracting, too annoying, too quiet, too something, in a way that's not just being accepted for who you are. Other people might kind of try to appease that and assure you, and oh no, everyone really likes you. And actually, again, often studies tell us that, you know, the reality is often not the case. People might judge somebody who's neurodivergent as less likable within seconds of meeting them. The research kind of tells us this. So speaking out if you don't understand a task, yes, absolutely. And again, just even things like asking questions to clarify your understanding is sometimes perceived by other people as though you're being challenging or being difficult, or you're just not getting on with things, or people might feel like, I don't understand why you're not understanding this. But if you're a literal thinker and a question is presented in a way that isn't actually as clear as it could be, then absolutely we're not going to understand what's expected of us. Long meetings, big meetings with lots of people in, absolutely. Things being different all the time, no routine, doing too many tasks at the same time and trying to work out what you do first. Loud construction noises, everything, I think, is quite a useful response there. Somebody's put everything. Masking, and the example there when speaking to customers, but just full stop, masking is actually very, very damaging and impacting for the neurodivergent person, and is often what feels like expected by neurotypical people for you to make everybody else's life easier. The time blindness, the volume of policies. Yeah, that's such an important point. The volume of emails, documents with lots and lots of lengthy things that you have to remember. It can be an absolute nightmare. People, just lots of stuff, actually, misunderstanding, stimming, people just misunderstanding, full stop. So some really, really, really interesting stuff there. So many responses. Thank you so much. I can't highlight them all. But yeah, just to kind of bear in mind that, yes, there might be many, many challenges in the workplace. First of all, with being accepted, with being believed that you are struggling with this, with people believing that you are doing, trying as hard as you can here, with people seeing the value and not just focusing on the differences in terms of the things that you struggle with, and having a balanced approach and recognizing all your many, many strengths. Just being in environments where you don't feel like you can be your true self is a challenge in and of itself. And then, as we've said, there are things like communication differences, managing your sensory sensitivities, the executive functioning differences, like managing your time, like organisation, like starting a task, like finishing a task, like remembering where you're up to and everything that needs to be done. Social interaction, whether that's online, in which the social cues are markedly different. So if you're in person versus you're in person with one person versus 8 people versus 8 people that you've not met yet, and this is the first time you're meeting them, coming up against misconceptions about what neurodivergence is or isn't, what that means, what you will or won't be capable of doing. Also, something that we've often been hearing in workplaces recently is other people then assuming that, for example, you're not going to want to do a task or be able to do a task and just taking over for you. And that feeling embarrassing, disempowering, just not nice. The challenges with change, attention, all these things that we've kind of already touched on, as well as actually getting access to the support that you need to do the work, as well as kind of, just feeling like you're in a culture that accepts differences and embraces differences, as just a few examples. So thinking for a moment then about, as a manager, because sometimes, we hear from managers and they feel, I don't really know what it is that I should be doing. I don't know what I'm expected to do. I don't know if I'm expected to know exactly what's going to work for somebody, what's not going to work for someone. People then worry about getting this wrong and making things worse. People worry that they should know exactly what reasonable adjustment somebody needs based on a diagnosis, or to know exactly what will or won't help. Just, it's useful just for us to kind of gauge, what do you feel is actually expected of you when you are supporting people, so we can think about also maybe what's not actually expected of you. Okay, so there's loads of responses to this already. Thank you, everyone. Very, very engaging bunch today. I love it. So we've got all sorts of things around like just understanding their needs, listening and acting, because everyone is different. Absolutely. So not assuming that because something worked for one person who has dyslexia, that that's now going to work for somebody else who has dyslexia, because that's just absolutely not the case. Asking the person, but they won't know what they need. Yes, and this is the thing as well. So as a manager, sometimes, you know, people default to asking the neurodivergent person, well, what do you need? And first of all, the neurodivergent person might not know what is or isn't adjustable. They might not have ever had any experience of reasonable adjustments, for example, before, and have no idea what will or won't be helpful. And so this kind of collaborative thinking, sharing of minds, sharing of ideas can be helpful. We've got things like just being flexible with people, being sensitive, adaptable. Yes, so you being open to adapting. Again, it's not just the neurodivergent person's responsibility to adapt all of the time to your expectations, your ways of working, your communication style, the environment as it is. You know, can we also be adapting our management style, adapt the way that we communicate in whatever way is best for them? Even if, you know, somebody would prefer you to be much more direct, succinct, to the point that you feel uncomfortable, like you're micromanaging almost. If that's what somebody would benefit from, then, you know, as much as it might be slightly uncomfortable for you at first to get used to, that's the best thing for them, to support them. Supporting yourself, because you won't have all the answers. Lots and lots and lots of stuff here around just listening, actually, like just listening, being open, being adaptable, being curious, absolutely, being open to discussions. Yeah, also being open to getting feedback, asking for feedback yourself, which again might be uncomfortable initially for you to do, and is going to improve that relationship, help you to help them. Active listening, putting them at the center of the conversation. Brilliant. Being patient, asking what to do. Yeah, loads and loads and loads of stuff here. Amazing. Addressing environmental concerns. That was the last thing I just saw, which again is brilliant. So, I mean, in terms of what is, you know, reasonably expected of you legally, there is a responsibility to require it to provide reasonable adjustments. And what is reasonable, adjustable, what's going to be helpful is going to look different for everybody, and that's okay. And it might take sometimes a bit of trial and error, going away and researching, you know, finding out, speaking to experts, you know, people who I don't know, autism charities, to think about what kind of adjustments have we not tried? What adjustments are we not considering here that might be absolutely brilliant? So just thinking, like we said, about providing reasonable adjustments and also reviewing those adjustments over time, not expect it, oh, okay, well, I've said that you can work from home twice a week now, so everything should be better now, and any other challenges, you need to work on them because I've made one change. Because also that change might not have had the intended effect. It might not be as useful as we hoped. Maybe it's even more useful than we hoped. But just being open to adapting and adjusting the adjustments that we think about, leading by example, creating what we call this like neuro-affirming environment. So this neuro-affirming, it's a way of thinking and behaving that really accepts differences in the way that we're all experiencing the world, and understanding that these differences are, again, natural variations of like the human brain, human experiences, and not seeing differences as deficits that need fixing all of the time. It's really, like I said, just kind of accepting the differences and valuing people for who they are, just as a whole. So trying to be a bit more understanding and accepting and supporting, and again, leading by example in the way that we talk about, you know, the fact that maybe we're turning the radio down, maybe making sure that we are having open conversations about the fact that we do all communicate differently and we don't all have to communicate in the same way, and that's okay. And that doesn't mean that somebody else and their communication style is any less valuable or they've got any less value to offer. Respecting individual differences as well, the fact that people have different wants and needs and preferences and lives, and they're existing in different bodies with different health statuses at different points. Being open to and, you know, actually taking on feedback in terms of what you're like as a manager and how you can be different. Communicating in people's preferred method. If people would rather that you email them even before a catch up and explain what it is that you're going to be catching up about, and there's a clear agenda even before that, and it's in black and white, and we kind of work through those things systematically, then you're going to get the best out of people by engaging with them in the way that works for them. Essentially, listening to people, not taking feedback too personally and becoming defensive, recognizing when we are, and focusing on that moment, as somebody said, like kind of looking after yourself so that you can support the people better, being patient, supporting people with signposting, which we're going to touch on in a minute. Versus, you are not expected to be diagnosing people. You are not expected to be offering unsolicited, unqualified advice. If you don't know something, it's much better to say, I don't know, and I'll go away and I'll try and get some answers and we can think together, versus, I went on this 45-minute introduction to neurodivergent session, so I'm going to tell you that this is going to work. Treating everyone equally is not expected, because that's not equitable. That doesn't make things fair. If you expect everyone to behave the same, perform the same, under the same circumstances, with the same instructions and the same communication, we're automatically putting some people at a disadvantage. So just generally not being expected to know absolutely everything, to pretend to know what's going to work for that person. When it comes to signposting support available, so again, it would be brilliant here, and there's an opportunity in a minute, if you're aware of any other services, if there's anything you're aware of that in your experience again has been useful, beneficial, please share them in the chat so people can see them, to make a note. But as well as things like, you know, your HR and liaising with like occupational health, or also referring people to your EAP for things like counselling or CBT, just even knowing that, again, while that can be useful, traditional talking therapies like counselling or CBT aren't always as effective for neurodivergent people. So if somebody is telling you they're struggling with stress or anxiety or their mental health generally, not expecting someone who's neurodivergent to just follow the traditional path. And again, just being open to research and finding out what might be more useful. And again, even just reasonable adjustments, like having a bit more time to go and engage with specialist interests, hobbies and interests that they don't have as much time or energy to engage with at the minute because work is taking so much. But that would add to people's quality of life. So in terms of signposting, there's loads and loads and loads of charities for specific neurodivergent conditions. There's also places like the Brain Charity that offers support for all sorts of different neurotypes, for example. So again, many different charities there offering lots of different types of support, information, resources, for example. And just remembering again that any support, reasonable adjustments aren't there to make someone behave as though they're neurotypical. Also thinking about, you know, ACAS can help with offering advice on reasonable adjustments. Remploy, Scope do all sorts of work, again, with helping disabled people to remain in employment. Access to work, again, there is support available through Access to Work for people. You don't need a formal diagnosis, whether that includes coaching, specialist equipment, support with physically attending work. If public transport is a sensory nightmare, they might provide, you know, funding towards taxis, for example. They can help with offering support for mental health, as well as offering a tailored support wellbeing plan then for businesses, for example. So again, if anyone is aware of any services that are also, you know, that weren't listed that are useful for neurodivergent people, it would be a brilliant opportunity to just kind of share some of that in the chat so that we can share ideas essentially and share these resources. And where we do make reasonable adjustments, again, we've done sessions and webinars specifically on this, we will do them again, but just again, it's much more important to focus on the individual in front of you and their unique challenges versus focusing on diagnosis, because every person with ADHD will experience ADHD differently, have different challenges when it comes to work. They're all living in different environments with different lives. Same with autism, same with dyslexia, same with dyspraxia, and so on. So whether people have a formal diagnosis or not, you know, making adjustments, and again, being open to assessing how well they're working or not working, being open to adapting them, and just having conversations, being open to going away and doing a bit of research and learning yourself as well. People might not know, they've not had experience of adjustments before, they might not know what you would consider reasonable for them to ask. But again, it could be as simple as, adapting ways of working, being able to adapt the environment, change the lighting, change the noise levels, having a quiet space to work from when you need to help with focus, to manage the sensory sensitivities. Research again by the Birkbeck Institute found that things like actually just a flexible schedule, being able to do some work from home, having access to a private space are all really, really very useful, as was reported by neurodivergent people, as well as maybe having some extra breaks, being able to have breaks from the environment, being able to adapt the way that you communicate with people, for example. Assistive software can go a long way here, like, providing time management software, mind mapping software, speech to text software, whatever that looks like. But again, just working with the person. But just lastly, as a reminder, the most important thing really is to be neuroaffirming, and bearing in mind when you're tired, you're stressed, you're exhausted, you might be more likely to jump to a very quick judgment about how somebody's behaving and what that means. And often it's not in the most favourable light or in the most understanding or accepting light for neurodivergent people. So again, differences are natural and they're neutral, and they're not necessarily something that's wrong that needs to be fixed. And we can look at the same behaviour differently. So if someone seems to struggle with team working, can I look at that through the lens of they're brilliant at independent working? If I think, someone struggles to stay focused, can I also recognise that they're capable of hyper-focus at times? If I think, someone's not taking initiative, actually, is it that I've not been very clear in terms of what's expected of them, for example? Rather than seeing someone as, even for example, seeing people as blunt or rude in their communication, can I see that they're very clear and direct and I know exactly what's expected of me? And it's a very time-sensitive way of communicating, rather than seeing someone as obsessed with something, they're passionate about something. So just looking at things in a more neuro-affirming way. And again, just to kind of pull this into practice, just as we pull the session together, even just, sometimes we hear from organisations that people ask too many questions in meetings or in group settings. They will ask lots and lots of questions about something and it feels unnecessary. It feels like they're getting over involved in things that they shouldn't be doing. Maybe it feels like they're procrastinating, they're avoiding getting started with something. We hear all sorts of perceptions, often negative, about somebody asking lots of questions. And there are other ways of looking at that same behaviour. So we've got in the word cloud, we've got people talking about actually people might just be curious. They might be seeking clarity, absolutely. And that's actually often the case, checking that I've understood what's expected of me, checking that I'm understanding this correctly. Curious. They're paying attention to detail. They're being precise. They want to get a full picture to understand the variables. Absolutely. Maybe they are just, recognizing elements of this here that other people aren't, and that's where the questions are coming from. Maybe they just really care about what they're doing. They're passionate. They're seeing things from different angles. They're trying to self-improve and develop. They're conscientious. Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. So yeah, just like we said, this was a very, very, very tip of the iceberg overview. Obviously, we can offer more tailored support to your organisation. So do get in touch if it's going to be useful. But just to remember, actually there are lots and lots of benefits of having different neurotypes in your environment. People who look at the environment differently, experience the same task differently, are likely to also find different ways of doing things that help the business to evolve and to grow. And actually, the more that we're accepting of individual differences, the more of an accepting culture that we're going to create, which creates safety for all of us, actually. So yeah, we like this quote around neurodivergence. It's not the differences that divide us, but our inability to recognise and accept and celebrate those differences. Different is not a bad word. But yeah, thank you all so much for being here and for being so engaging, super engaging this morning, which we love. We've also actually on our website, there's lots and lots of information around things like reasonable adjustments. So I've just seen a question there, resources, websites you can share with exploring possible reasonable adjustments. Have a look on our website. There's all sorts of guides on there, tips. We've got webinars. Again, some of the resources that we already spoke about, places like Access to Work, some of the specific organisations, some of these might be able to offer all sorts of stuff. Also, do you know what's an underutilised resource sometimes is even sometimes looking on social media for people with lived experience, like autistic coaches, like coaches for people with autism who are autistic, people, ADHD coaches who have ADHD. They will often share invaluable insights, invaluable suggestions, information coming from a place of both the theoretical understanding and the knowledge of things that might help, and also the lived experience. So learn from neurodivergent people, that quite fundamentally. But yeah, so hopefully that's helpful. And yeah, like we said, please, please, please do look back through the chat, share anything. I'm just trying to check if there's anything that I've missed. Able Futures, I've just seen as a recommendation. Brilliant. Yeah, use one another as a resource. But yeah, just thank you all so much for being here and for being so open-minded and being curious. That's, you know, the best thing that we can hope for, particularly if you're new to the topic. So really, really, really genuinely appreciate it, and you sharing so many ideas. Take care of yourselves, have a peaceful rest of the week, and hopefully see you again. Bye for now, everyone. Take care. Bye.